No one warned me about him, about the office where no employee smiled, about the security guards who spoke in code, about the man who ran the entire floor without ever lifting his voice. I was just a temp secretary trying to make it through the month, until I brought coffee into his office, and my eyes landed exactly where they shouldn't have. It slipped out before I could stop it. My God, is that real or is it a gun? He heard every syllable. He crossed the room and stopped close enough that the heat of his skin reached my face. Why are you afraid of the bulge in my pants? I should have been afraid. I should have apologized. But the truth was worse. I wasn't afraid. I was imagining it. Chapter 1. Is that real or is it a gun? Being late was one thing. The universe apparently had decided to make it worse. The subway died between two stations for 12 minutes that stretched out like a bad dream. And the moment the doors finally parted, I bolted across the platform in full disarray. Blazer twisted on my shoulders, half my bun unraveling down my neck, a coffee stain blooming on my blouse that I tried to disguise behind the strap of my bag. 6 blocks in heels stood between me and the Marchetti Import and Trade Building, and I crossed every single one at a stumbling jog that earned me 3 concerned glances from men in suits. Not appreciative ones, the kind reserved for people who look like they might collapse on the sidewalk. The Midtown Tower was the antithesis of everything I represented at that moment. Marble buffed to a mirror, lighting clearly billed by the lumen, and a reception counter staffed by people who appeared to have had their smiles surgically removed. I gave my name to the receptionist, a woman whose bun looked carved from stone, and she ran her finger down the visitor list with the wary expression of a customs officer, flagging a suspect document. 22nd floor. Mr. Conti is waiting. The elevator was so quiet and quick, I barely registered the climb, but the moment the doors slid open onto the Marchetti Import floor, something shifted. Not the air conditioning, not the lighting, the atmosphere itself. The whole floor seemed to be inhaling, holding its breath, watching. A man in his 50s stood waiting beside a frosted glass door, hands clasped at his waist, the ghost of a smile barely registering on his face. Raffaello Conti, the company's administrative director, carried himself like a man who had stopped being surprised by anything roughly 2 decades ago. Miss Damiani, he glanced at his watch with the casual cruelty of someone who didn't need to say anything else. Punctuality is rule 1, discretion is rule 2, and rule 3, which I consider non-negotiable, you do not enter Mr. Marchetti's office unless you are summoned. He waited, the pause clearly engineered to let each rule sink in before laying down the next, then continued in the same flat cadence of a flight attendant reciting safety instructions. If the phone rings and Mr. Marchetti doesn't pick up, you don't try again. If something urgent comes up, write it down and pass the note along. You don't interrupt meetings. And under no circumstances, none, do you open any envelope without a return address. I nodded along to all of it, biting back the impulse to defend myself with a story about the subway sabotaging my morning, while he led me down a wide corridor to an antechamber. A dark mahogany desk waited there with a computer, a phone, and a chair far too plush for a temp. On the wall behind my seat hung a black and white photograph of a port, freighters, cranes, a smudged horizon swallowed by fog. No caption, no explanation. Raffaello indicated my chair, set a folder of guidelines beside the keyboard, and walked off without another syllable. The first hour was nothing but silence, not the kind that settles over a library, the kind that fills a doctor's waiting room before bad news. Severo Marchetti's office door stood about 10 feet from my desk, and in less than an hour, 4 men passed through it. None acknowledged me, none smiled. The third wore a heavy wedding band, and the dead eyes of someone who'd long since stopped questioning what he was told to do. The fourth came out with his right hand wrapped in white gauze, a fresh red blot soaking through, which he tucked under the cuff of his jacket the moment he hit the hallway. Nobody on the floor reacted. Nobody looked. The kind of silence reached only by collective agreement that nothing at all had happened. With no instructions to follow, I sorted the paperclips in my desk drawer by color. Blue, red, silver, black. Then by size. Then I built little towers out of them. My hands needed work, or my mouth would invent its own. And in this place, talking to myself didn't seem like a smart strategy for staying employed. The whole floor functioned at a deliberate, hushed register. Phones chimed instead of ringing. Doors closed without ever quite shutting. Footsteps in the hall came measured and contained, as though everyone had been trained to take up as little sonic space as humanly possible. Severo's office sat behind a double set of dark wood doors with brushed steel handles, and the slim band of light beneath them flickered now and then. A shadow shifting, someone pacing, a presence I felt without having to see. It was nearly noon when those doors opened for the 5th time, except now no one was leaving. Severo Marchetti himself stepped into the antechamber and stopped in front of my desk, and somehow the entire room shrank around him. White shirt, top 2 buttons undone, sleeves pushed up to the elbows, exposing a left arm covered in ink, religious imagery tangled with symbols I couldn't place, dark lines etched into bronze skin, charcoal trousers cut by someone who knew what they were doing, shoes that made no sound at all on the hardwood, a jaw built out of straight lines, hair cut close, eyes so black, the pupil disappeared into the iris. He didn't greet me, didn't ask my name, didn't notice the coffee stain on my blouse. "Coffee," he said. The voice was low, even, unhurried. "Double espresso, no sugar, black cup, top shelf of the pantry." Then he was gone, back into his office. The door closed with a quiet click that managed to feel more final than any slam. The pantry was at the end of the hall, a narrow strip of countertop, a sink, a professional-grade espresso machine, and shelves built for someone with about 5 inches on me. The black cup, of course, sat on the top shelf, shoved up against the back wall. I dragged over a metal stool, climbed onto it on tiptoe, and stretched until my shoulders started complaining. My fingers grazed the first cup. It slid, hit the counter with a sharp crack. I lunged for it with my other hand and lost my balance, taking down a second in the process. The third rolled, teetered at the edge, and exploded on the floor with all the elegance of a minor traffic accident. I climbed down, surveyed the disaster, shards across the tile, 2 surviving cups with chips bitten out of their rims, and did the only thing that made sense in the moment. I dug through my bag for the tube of superglue I'd been carrying since my heel snapped the previous week, and reattached the handle to the least injured cup, with the trembling focus of a panicked surgeon. I blew on it. I pressed it. I prayed to 3 different saints and an apostle for backup. The handle held. 2 minutes later, the espresso was done. Double, no sugar, served in a black cup held together by adhesive and faith. I carried the saucer down the hallway with both hands, bumped the door with my elbow because my fingers were busy not spilling, and stepped inside. Severo Marchetti was leaning over his desk, both palms braced on the mahogany, scanning a stack of papers. The angle pulled his shoulders broader, his shirt taut across his back, in places that I should not have been cataloging, and the window light behind him sliced his outline clean against the Manhattan skyline with the precision of a deliberate composition. I set the cup down beside his left hand, the tattooed one, and turned to leave. That was the moment my eyes drifted. The trousers, the cut, the way he was leaning, everything seemed engineered against me, and my gaze landed exactly where it had no business going. Heat shot up my face. I looked at the ceiling, the window, the door, and then somehow, I looked again, because apparently my eyes had filed a formal grievance against my brain. I was already walking out, almost safe, almost free, and then my mouth, which had been operating without my permission since I was about 14, decided this was the optimal moment to broadcast a thought. "Oh my God, is that real? Or is that a gun?" It came out as a murmur, the kind I assumed would stay strictly between me and the carpet, but the office was too quiet, the carpet was too thin, and Severo Marchetti had the ears of something that hunted for sport. I heard the papers being set down, then footsteps on the rug, slow, unhurried, each one closing the distance. I stopped walking. I stopped breathing. His shadow swallowed mine before I could turn around, and when I finally did, he was already too close. His chest was right at my eyeline, heat coming through the white cotton, the scent of something dark and expensive. Wood, maybe? Something I couldn't name, registering in my body before my brain caught up. He bent his head until his mouth was level with my ear, and the whisper that came out hummed all the way down my spine. "Why are you afraid of what's in my pants?" The room emptied of air. My heartbeat was so loud, I was sure he could hear it, because we were inches apart, and the silence was total. I opened my mouth to say something, to explain, to apologize, to hand in my resignation on the spot, but nothing came. For the first time in my entire life, my mouth chose to malfunction, and the timing was nothing short of catastrophic. He waited, eyes locked on mine, no blink, no shift. The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile exactly, more like a flicker of amusement in the eyes of a man who looked allergic to being amused. Then he stepped back, returned to his desk, sat down, and lifted the superglued cup, as if none of it had happened. "Coffee's weak," he said it without looking up, eyes on the documents. The implied dismissal in the air now traded for a flat indifference so smooth it felt rehearsed. I walked out of the office at a pace too quick to be graceful and too slow to qualify as fleeing, pulled the door shut with both hands, because I didn't trust my fingers to find the handle clean on the first try, and leaned my forehead against the wood for a full second before I could make myself move. I sat back down at my desk, dropped my face into my hands, and stayed there for some indeterminate stretch of time. His door stayed closed, the floor stayed silent, and I had, on my first day of employment, openly remarked on the contents of my boss's trousers. I tried to replay the last 5 minutes, hoping memory had warped the facts, hoping I'd said something less ruinous, maybe a comment about the trousers themselves, the cut, the fabric, anything that could be salvaged as a vaguely professional observation. But my memory was photographic, and it served the line back to me with surgical clarity. Is that real, or is that a gun? I had said that, out loud, to him, on day 1. The chair was comfortable. The salary was generous. My mother's medical bills weren't going to settle themselves, and I had spent 6 years catching the 6:30 subway to jobs worse than this one, working under bosses worse than this one, though none of them had ever managed to bend the air in a room just by existing in it. I straightened up, smoothed my blazer, and decided I wasn't going anywhere. If I'd survived the New York City subway, I could survive this man. Chapter 2. Rules no one bothered to explain. My attempt at being a professional lasted less than an hour the next morning. The phone rang for the first time at 9:12, and I picked up using the voice I'd rehearsed in my bathroom mirror. Firm, polished, precisely the tone of someone who works at a serious company. The receiver slid out of my grip before I made it through the second word, ricocheted off the keyboard, hit the desk, and bounced down to the carpet with a clatter that echoed across the entire antechamber. Marchetti Import and, "I'm so sorry, I dropped it," I told the phone, now lying on the floor, as I dove under my desk to retrieve it. The person on the other end waited in the kind of patient silence reserved for people they'd already decided not to like. Marchetti Import and Trade. Good morning. The whole first week unfolded in roughly that key. Severo Marchetti handed me assignments with deadlines that felt more like trials by fire. 5 years of dead files to sort in 2 hours, commercial documents to translate from Italian into English, where my passable Italian transformed riunione importante into dangerous meeting, because the words looked similar enough and the pressure wasn't doing me any favors. He never corrected the errors. He'd skim what I delivered, glance up for a beat, and return to whatever he was reading without a single word. I couldn't tell if the silence meant the work was acceptable, or if he was quietly building a dossier toward an extraordinary firing at the end of the month. On the second day, while excavating those dead files in a cramped storage room at the end of the hall, a photograph slipped out from between 2 yellowed folders. 2 boys with their backs to a sprawling house. The younger one looked about 7, the older maybe 12 or 13, both barefoot in the grass, dressed for summer, and there was something about the older one's posture that snagged at me without my being able to say why. I flipped it over. On the back, in a firm pencil hand, L and S, summer. I tucked it into the inside pocket of my blazer without thinking. I didn't know what it meant, didn't know why I cared, but something about that image, the squared shoulders of the older boy, the smaller hand he held, pulled at the bottom of my stomach. By day 3, a man I didn't recognize had materialized in the hallway. Tall, granite-faced, military bearing, back ruler straight, shoulders broad, eyes sweeping the room in a slow scan before settling. He stationed himself beside the door of Severo's office with the easy familiarity of someone who did it every day, and when I asked him who he was, he made do with the absolute minimum number of words. Tommaso Vianello, floor security. He didn't extend his hand, didn't smile, didn't shift. And I, who had never figured out how to live inside someone else's silence without trying to plug it, gave it another go. Floor security? Like, the entire floor needs its own personal guard? What are you importing here? Plutonium. Nothing. He stared at the wall just to the right of my head as if I were a draft. Right. You're the silent type. I respect it. My therapist keeps telling me to try silence, but every time I do, my mouth makes its own decisions and then, you talk too much. The line came out flat. No inflection, no judgment. A clinical observation. I opened my mouth, closed it, and for the second time that week found myself temporarily out of words. Then, because I was who I was, I know, it's a medical thing. He didn't react, but his shoulders eased by about a millimeter, and I decided that counted as the foundation of a friendship. That same afternoon, the intercom on my desk pulsed once. Short, no voice, and I understood it as a summons. I walked into Severo's office and found him standing beside my empty chair, holding a document that needed corrections. He could have left the page on my desk. He could have emailed it. Instead, he waited for me to come in, and the moment I started reading, he positioned himself beside me, too close. The tattooed arm hovered inches from my shoulder. The heat of his body bled through the cotton of his shirt, and that woody scent that had begun to register in my nervous system before I even saw him filled the small distance between us. He pointed to a line on the document with his index finger, and the gesture brushed his arm against mine, a contact that lasted half a second, and that my body logged in full, from the curve of my shoulder all the way to my fingertips. I read the entire document without absorbing a syllable of it, turned to leave, and stopped. You're aware there's this thing called personal space, right? It was out before I could catch it, and a heartbeat later I went still for the third time that week, because I had just lectured the most intimidating man I'd ever met, in an office where no one ever raised their voice to him. Tommaso, on the other side of the cracked door, suddenly developed a very pressing interest in the wall. The window behind Severo framed the entire Manhattan skyline, and for one absurd second I thought it would make a beautiful backdrop for a termination. He looked at me for 2 seconds that lasted a week. His jaw didn't move, his eyes didn't drift, and I had the very distinct impression he was deciding between firing me on the spot and letting me stay just to find out what would come out of my mouth next. Personal space is something I decide who has earned. I walked out on legs that didn't entirely belong to me, and dropped into my chair convinced this company was going to kill me, not through anything dangerous, but through cardiac arrest. 2 days later, Raffaello showed up in the antechamber holding car keys, and the news that I'd be accompanying him to Bensonhurst to pick up paperwork from one of the company's businesses. The car was black, anonymous, quiet, and Raffaello drove, or rather, the driver drove, from Midtown to Brooklyn, with the practiced rhythm of a man who made the trip 3 times a week. Conversation was minimal. Raffaello answered what I asked, and nothing further, and I was beginning to understand that in this world, information was currency. Nobody handed it out for free. The restaurant sat on a leafy block in Bensonhurst, wedged between a laundromat and an accountant's office. The facade was understated, dark wood, cream curtains in the windows, no loud signage, but the name glowed in gold letters above the door, set into a black frame that looked more like a memorial plaque, Leander's. We came in through the back, and 3 men at a table in the rear stood up the instant Raffaello crossed the threshold. It wasn't a casual gesture. It was automatic, drilled in, the reflex of men who know precisely where they sit in a hierarchy. Raffaello continued on to a private room in the back, and I lingered in the hallway, eyes drifting to the name printed again, smaller, on the interior wall, above a black and white photograph I couldn't quite make out from where I stood. The restaurant smelled of slow-simmered tomato sauce and baking bread, but the details kept catching my eye in ways that didn't fit a place that was supposedly just a restaurant. The windows held glass too thick for the neighborhood. The back door had 2 locks. The 3 men who'd stood up for Raffaello had not looked like waiters. One of them murmured something to the other in Italian too fast for me to track, and the 2 of them studied me with the unreadable face of people performing an evaluation they don't want you to notice. "Who's Leander?" I asked when Raffaello came back out with a leather folio. He looked at me with the careful expression of a man who measures every word before he releases it. "Someone important to the family, nothing more." He held the door open for me, and we walked back out the same way we'd come in. On the sidewalk, 2 men leaning against a black sedan went silent the moment they saw me. The taller one had a thick scar that ran from the lobe of his ear all the way down into his shirt collar, and the look he gave me wasn't hostile. It was assessing, cold, the gaze of a man calculating whether something needed to be done. The second one kept his hands buried in the pockets of his coat, and the way the fabric pulled against his right hip made it clear his pockets weren't the only thing he was carrying. Before I could decide whether I was afraid or not, Tommaso was suddenly beside me. I hadn't even registered him being in the car, but there he was, between me and the 2 men, his body angled in a way that unilaterally redrew the sidewalk into his territory. Nobody said a word. The 2 men resumed their conversation. Tommaso guided me toward the car with a light hand at my elbow, and Raffaello slid into the back seat with the placid air of a man who'd seen nothing worth remarking on. The fear was brief, but real. A short, sharp twist at the base of my stomach, reminding me that I wasn't sitting in some run-of-the-mill import office. I was in a place where men stood at attention when the boss arrived, and where security used their bodies as walls. On the final day of the week, at end of shift, Severo Marchetti walked past my desk on his way to the elevator. He paused. He didn't turn his whole body, just his head, over his shoulder, with the same economy of motion that made every one of his movements look deliberate. "You survived the first week." I looked up at him, and for a fraction of a second considered saying thank you. But the tone wasn't congratulatory. It was an observation tinged with something close to surprise. "You say that like you weren't sure I would." The corner of his mouth twitched again, that not-quite smile I'd seen exactly once before, and which, for reasons I was actively refusing to examine, kept replaying in my head longer than it had any right to. He stepped into the elevator without responding. The doors closed, and I stood there for 3 full seconds staring at the brushed steel before I picked up my bag and left. On the subway home to Queens, I called Elise. "I survived," I said, letting my forehead rest against the grimy window. "The subway or the hot boss?" "Elise, I never said he was hot. You described unblinking dark eyes, tattooed hands, a jawline cut for a cologne ad, and the fact that the whole office goes still when he talks." I extrapolated. I shut my eyes as the train shuddered and let myself think about the restaurant, the men rising to their feet, the funeral frame of the Leander's sign, the scarred man on the sidewalk, Tommaso's body interposed like a breakwater. "Elise? The office has armed security, like actual security, not a doorman with a walkie-talkie. And the restaurant in Bensonhurst, everyone treats Raffaello, the director, like he's royalty." The silence on the line stretched 4 full seconds. For Elise, who'd never managed 4 seconds of quiet in her entire life, that was alarming. Know me, an import CEO with armed security and a restaurant in Bensonhurst where every guy in the place stands up when he walks in? That's money laundering. I laughed, because laughing was easier than entertaining the possibility that my best friend had just nailed it on the first try. "It's an import company, Elise. They import things." "Oh, they import all right? Probably problems." The subway jolted again, and my hand drifted to the inside of my blazer pocket, where the photograph of the 2 boys was still folded against the lining. L and S. Summer. The older boy with the squared shoulders, the younger one holding his hand. The picture meant nothing, and meant everything at the same time, and I couldn't say why, only that I had no intention of giving it back. When I got home, my mother was already asleep. The kitchen light had been left on. Her medication was lined up on the tray next to a glass of water, and the apartment smelled of the rosemary cream she massaged into her joints every night. I switched off the light, covered the coffee stain on my blouse with my palm, and went to my room thinking about dark eyes that didn't blink, and a voice that asked questions that weren't really questions. All week long, I had been hyper-aware of Severo Marchetti, the rhythm of his footsteps in the hallway, the way the air thickened when he passed my desk, the woody scent that arrived a second before him and lingered a second after. I knew the cadence of his walk, the meter of his short sentences, the precise instant his eyes lifted from his documents to check whether I was still in my chair. And the worst part wasn't knowing all of that. The worst part was that I had no idea why I was paying such close attention. Chapter 3. You talk too much. The next week, Raffaello called me into his office and announced, in the tone of a man delivering a promotion and a verdict in the same breath, that my photographic memory had caught Mr. Marchetti's notice. From that day forward, I would be running his calendar, screening his correspondence, and prepping documents for review before meetings. Translated. I was about to spend more hours in close orbit around Severo Marchetti than any temp secretary could reasonably consider safe. The work itself wasn't the problem. He was. Severo had begun provoking me in a way I couldn't comfortably file under either professional or personal. It was in the way his eyes lingered a beat past polite, the deliberate pauses before he handed me a document. Pauses that forced me to reach further, to almost graze his fingers, and the half-octave drop in his voice every time he said my first name instead of my last, a sound that made every nerve in my body stand to attention against my will. That morning, he stopped at my desk to go over a contract I'd revised, and instead of taking the page back into his office, he leaned across me to point at a clause directly on the screen. His tattooed arm hung inches from my face, close enough for me to take in every line of the ink against his bronze skin. A saint with hands folded in prayer, framed in roses and thorns, occupied the inside of his bicep, a gilded halo bleeding down into the rosary that wound around his forearm. "Is that St. Rita of Cascia on your arm?" He turned his head slowly. His eyes met mine at a distance that turned breathing into a delicate negotiation. "Yes, that's bold, putting a saint right next to a what?" The voice was low and even, but there was something underneath it that was equal parts dare and curiosity. He wanted to hear the rest of the sentence, and I knew whatever I said would bury me. My mouth, faithful to its lifelong habit of operating without supervision, answered before my brain could file an objection. Right next to a man who has clearly never set foot in a church. The silence that followed stretched across 3 full beats of my heart. His jaw shifted, not in irritation, but in restraint. His eyes narrowed, his lips pressed together, and for a moment I caught something I hadn't expected, the visible effort of holding back a smile. He didn't laugh, but he came closer to laughing than I'd thought a man with that face was capable of, and the almost was somehow more unnerving than an actual laugh would have been. He pulled back without saying anything else, returned to his office, and closed the door. I sat there staring at my screen with my pulse in my throat, and the dawning realization that provoking Severo Marchetti might be the most dangerous and most addictive thing I had ever stumbled into. A few days later, the situation escalated. Severo canceled my lunch break for the 3rd day in a row, always with the same vague justification of too much work and too little time. The first time I sucked it up. The second I gritted my teeth. The third I stood up from my desk, walked to his office, opened the door without knocking, sailing straight through Raffaello's rule number 3, and planted myself in front of his desk with my arms crossed. I don't eat prestige. If you want me functioning, I need 20 minutes, a chair, and something edible that isn't my own dignity. It came out louder than I'd intended. The whole hallway heard it. A door clicked shut somewhere down the corridor, and the silence that dropped over the floor was so dense I could almost feel its texture. Nobody, at any point in the company's history, had ever talked to Severo Marchetti like that. I knew because Tommaso, posted by the door, turned his face toward the wall in a movement so subtle only someone watching for it would have caught it, and he was hiding the shadow of something that, in another life, could have qualified as a laugh. Severo looked up at me from his documents. The pen between his fingers stopped turning. His face didn't change, not a single muscle, not a flicker, and he assessed me with the surgical care of a man who calculates every response before he allows it out. 20 minutes. I walked out of his office with my dignity intact, and my legs not entirely cooperating, and dropped into my chair feeling like I'd just survived a controlled detonation. The following morning, when I got to work, there was a plate waiting on my desk. White porcelain, linen napkin. A meal I recognized by the smell before I even looked. The same gnocchi al pesto I'd seen being plated at Leander's the day I went out to Bensonhurst with Raffaello. No card. No explanation. I looked over at Tommaso, holding his usual concrete wall stance in the corridor. He looked back. Then he looked at the ceiling. Then at the wall. I ate every bite without asking where it had come from, because the answer was already obvious. And acknowledging that it was obvious would have opened a door I wasn't ready to walk through. A few days after that, Raffaello informed me that I'd be accompanying Mr. Marchetti to Bensonhurst for a meeting. I rode the elevator down, crossed the lobby, and found the black car waiting at the curb with the driver holding the back door open. Severo was already inside, tablet on his lap, attention fixed on the screen. I climbed in through the other side and slid as far away from him as the back seat would allow, which, in a sedan, came out to about 16 inches that felt closer to 4. The first 10 minutes were electric silence. The car carved its way through Manhattan traffic toward Brooklyn, and I felt his presence beside me with an awareness that overrode anything rational. He didn't look at me. I didn't look at him. But the tension between us had a physical weight, and when the driver hit the brakes hard at an intersection and I lurched forward, Severo's hand shot out by reflex, fast, precise, and stopped in midair just short of touching me. He withdrew it without a word, and went back to his tablet. "Your driver drives like he's being chased by someone," I said, because the silence was killing me, and my mouth had always been faster than my survival instinct. Maybe he is. The line was dry, but there was something layered under it. Not quite humor, but the shadow of a man who found the wrong things funny at the wrong times. He set the tablet on the seat between us and looked at me, fully, for the first time since I'd gotten into the car. "You're in law school. Why work here?" The question came with no build-up, no cushion, and the way he delivered it, flat, unsoftened, caught me off guard enough that I answered with the truth instead of the edited version. "My mother is sick, rheumatoid arthritis, chronic depression, and a health plan that covers about half of what it's supposed to. I need the salary. I need it to be a good one, because joint pain medication costs about the same as a semester of textbooks." He didn't reply. He didn't offer sympathy, didn't change the subject, didn't pull on a pity face. He just looked at me with those dark eyes that surrendered nothing and said, "You're terrible at faking." I couldn't tell if it was an insult or a compliment. I decided to take it as both. He turned back to the window, and for a moment I saw something I hadn't expected. The line of his jaw eased, his shoulders dropped half an inch, and the hand that had been holding the tablet released it onto the leather between us. Fingers spread, only inches from mine. He didn't offer it, didn't move it, but he didn't pull it away either, and the distance was small enough that I could feel the heat of his skin without touching. The car swung onto the Brooklyn Bridge, and neither of us moved, and I spent the rest of the drive trying very hard not to think about what would happen if I closed the gap. At Leander's, Severo disappeared into the private room in the back for the meeting, and I took a chair in the hallway beside a window that overlooked the alley. For the first 15 minutes, I caught only murmurs, male voices, professional tone, the rhythm of a business conversation. At some point, someone opened the door to call for coffee, and the gap in the doorframe stayed open long enough for the tone inside to shift and carry down the hall. Severo's voice, which until then had been controlled and measured, dropped into a register I didn't recognize. Deeper, flat, stripped of any inflection. Every word arrived loaded. I told him there would be a consequence. He didn't believe me. Now he does. A chair scraped. Someone cleared their throat. The silence that settled in that room had a different texture from the silences I'd come to know in this world. It was fear, distilled and concentrated, radiating off men who I was certain feared almost nothing. When Severo emerged from the room, he carried himself the way he always did, shoulders square, steps measured, face unreadable. But there was a mark on the cuff of his shirt, nearly invisible against the white fabric, red, small, about the size of a fingerprint. He caught my gaze, fastened the cuff one-handed, and walked toward the door without offering an explanation. I followed in silence, and for the first time since I'd started working there, the silence wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. I had no words for what I'd just heard, and my body understood instinctively that I shouldn't go searching for any. On the sidewalk in front of the restaurant, the driver had the car door open. I was walking too fast, distracted, still turning over the fragments of the meeting in my head, and my heel caught the lip of the curb. The fall would have been a full one. Knees on asphalt, dignity on the pavement, if Severo's hand hadn't closed around my arm. His fingers shut just above my elbow with a firmness that was control, not force, and the heat of him cut through my blazer with an intensity wildly out of proportion to the gesture. He steadied me, and his hand stayed there a second longer than the save required, long enough for me to register the press of his thumb on the inside of my arm, a light contact my entire body logged. Then he released me and got into the car without speaking. I climbed in from the other side with my arm still warm, and the certainty, sitting in the pit of my stomach, that the touch had not been accidental. Neither of us mentioned it. But for the rest of the drive back to Manhattan, I could feel the exact place his hand had been, and he kept his eyes on the window the whole way, and the silence said more than any conversation could have. The following week, on an afternoon that had already started its slow drift toward the end of shift, I carried his coffee into his office for what had to be the 10th or 12th time. I'd lost count. Except this time, something was different. The coffee was good. Not good in the grudging way he'd described my earlier attempts, but actually good. Dense crema, the right temperature, the bitterness balanced. Severo lifted the cup to his lips, drank, and set it back on the saucer with a quiet click. Acceptable. It was the first time he had used a word about my coffee that wasn't a critique, and the satisfaction that bloomed in my chest was disproportionate and absurd. I turned to leave, and at the threshold, without looking back, I said, "You're welcome, Your Majesty." I knew he heard it, and he knew I knew. Neither of us commented on it, but something settled into place in that exchange, a ritual that didn't need a name to exist. From that afternoon on, the 5:30 coffee was mine. He never complained again, and I never called him Your Majesty out loud again, only in my head. Chapter 4. You weren't supposed to see that. The dress arrived in an unmarked black box, hand-delivered by a courier who didn't say where it had come from. He didn't need to. Tommaso appeared in the antechamber and informed me, with his usual conservation of syllables, that Mr. Marchetti requested my presence at a formal dinner that evening. Charity event. Cipriani, Wall Street. Black tie required. I opened the box alone in the floor's pantry and lifted the dress out of the layers of tissue paper. Black, floor-length, fabric that flowed through my hands with a weight I recognized from boutique windows I'd never had any business walking into. One shoulder, modest neckline, a high closed back. Elegant enough for Cipriani, restrained enough not to advertise that someone else had paid for it. I came back to the antechamber with the box tucked under my arm and found Tommaso in his usual stance, leaning against the wall beside the office door. "He does know assistants don't get paid for this, right?" Tommaso didn't move. He knows. And that doesn't worry you? A lot of things worry me. Your wardrobe isn't on the list. I opened my mouth to respond, closed it, and considered for the first time the very real possibility that Tommaso Vianello had a sense of humor, bone dry, buried under several layers of silence, but real. The car picked me up from the office in the late afternoon, and the drive to Wall Street took 40 minutes through traffic. Cipriani occupied the inside of a building with stone columns and a ceiling so high it made everyone underneath it feel smaller, and I, at 5'4" in heels, didn't need any help in that department. I crossed the entrance hall beside Severo and felt, for the first time with real clarity, the gap between the two worlds I was straddling. In the morning, I rode a packed subway out of Queens, wedged between backpacks and elbows. By night, I was walking into a marble hall where the waiters wore white gloves. And next to me, the man responsible for the transition moved with the calm of someone who belonged in the room, and in every room before it. The space was warm and gilded and full of people who knew exactly where they fit. Men in tuxedos, women in dresses that cost more than a year of my apartment's rent, waiters threading between them with trays of champagne and trained smiles. Within the first wave of arrivals, I'd already understood that the dinner wasn't really about charity. It was about power. Every man who approached Severo did it with a quiet kind of reverence, a hand extended after a half-second of hesitation, a gaze that lifted slowly, a voice that pitched itself a notch lower. No one approached him with the casual ease of a colleague. They approached him the way you approach someone whose courtesy is the only thing standing between conversation and something considerably worse. Severo moved through the room with the practiced ease of a man born into this kind of evening, every gesture precise, every greeting calibrated, every smile politely absent. When he stepped away to talk with a cluster of older men on the far side of the room, I lingered alone near the appetizer table, holding a champagne flute I didn't quite have the nerve to drink, and that's when he came over. Gideon Salvarezza approached from my left, and the first thing I registered was the smile, wide, easy, full of white teeth and unearned confidence. Tall, brown hair combed back, navy suit cut by someone who knew their craft, a watch on his wrist that caught the chandelier light brighter than the chandelier itself. He was good-looking the way men on magazine covers are good-looking, polished, engineered, free of any visible flaw, and something about that polish put a chill in my chest. Severo Marchetti doesn't bring assistants to these dinners, he said, extending a hand as if we'd already met. The voice was smooth, polite, calibrated with care to sound like nothing at all. Gideon Salvarezza. A pleasure. I took his hand, because there wasn't a socially viable alternative, and the grip lasted a beat longer than it should have. The chill that ran down my spine had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. Nomi Damiani, I said, retrieving my hand. Damiani, he repeated, and the way he turned the syllables over had the inflection of a man placing something without showing his work. Beautiful name. Italian? Before I could answer, Severo's hand landed on my back, not on the shoulder, at the base of my spine, fingers spread wide, palm flat against the fabric. The gesture wasn't gentle. It was territorial, declarative, the physical equivalent of an electric fence. Gideon's eyes flicked to the hand, then to Severo, and his smile didn't fade so much as sharpen, become more conscious of itself, and he took a step back with the elegance of a man who'd received the message in full and was filing it away for later use. Enjoy the evening, Severo. Gideon walked off, and Severo's hand didn't move. It stayed there for the rest of the dinner, on my back when we sat down, on my shoulder when he leaned across to address someone on his left, on the back of my chair when he stood to greet an ally. The heat of his fingers came through the thin fabric and reached my skin with a steadiness that left me dizzy and irritated in roughly equal measure. Halfway through dinner, I excused myself for the bathroom, and when I pushed open the door to the ladies' room, 2 women were chatting at the sink with the careless intimacy of people who don't think anyone's listening. Marchetti's new one? Poor girl. The last one he looked at like that disappeared in 3 months. The other woman laughed, a short, mirthless laugh. Disappeared, or was disappeared. I slipped into a stall before either of them noticed me, locked the door, and held still for 30 seconds with my heart slamming against my ribs. By the time I came out, they were gone, and I washed my hands looking at my own reflection, the dress he had chosen, the face he had been looking at, and the question I couldn't answer. What exactly did disappear mean in the vocabulary of this world? I returned to the table with a smile already in place and cold hands. I sat down, glanced at the cutlery laid out in front of me, and realized I was holding the wrong fork for the salad. Dessert fork in my left hand, fish knife in my right, an etiquette disaster anyone in that room would identify in half a second. I switched the utensils with as much discretion as I could manage, and muttered under my breath, just loud enough to reach my own ears. Right, Nomi. Here even the salad gets its own fork. Back home we eat with our hands. The corner of Severo's mouth moved. I saw it because I was watching, and I was watching because, by that point, I already knew that the micro-movements of his face were the closest thing to emotion he ever allowed himself in public. On the way out, the car was waiting at the curb. Severo opened the door for me, a gesture I hadn't anticipated, and one that made me hesitate for a second before sliding in. He got in beside me, and the car began moving toward Queens when his phone rang. The shift was instant. He answered with his face hardened and his voice dropped into that low, flat register I'd first heard at Leander's. The Italian came out quick, sharp, and I caught fragments between the sentences. Port, salvarezza, blood, handle it. He ended the call, pushed the phone into his jacket pocket, stared straight ahead for 5 seconds with the expression of a man who'd just been handed information that demanded action, and when he turned to me, his eyes carried the calculated chill of someone already mapping the next move. I'm taking you home. The line was simple, but the voice belonged to someone else entirely, not the man who'd kept his hand on my back through dinner. It was the man who made other men rise to their feet when he walked into a restaurant. When the car pulled up in front of my building in Queens, I opened the door, stepped onto the sidewalk, and froze. A black car with tinted windows was parked across the street, and through the windshield, I could see 2 men looking in my direction. It wasn't a neighbor's car. It wasn't a rideshare waiting on a fare. It was surveillance, plain and unhidden. I went upstairs fast, double-locked the apartment door, and called Tommaso with shaking fingers. There's a car in front of my building. 2 men inside. Who are they? They're ours. Mr. Marchetti sent them. He sent what? He sent them to look out for you. I hung up, walked to the living room window, and stood there staring at the black car on the dark street while my mother slept in the room next door. Look out for me. The phrase rotated in my head and refused to settle anywhere comfortable because protection in this context implied danger. And if I needed protection, the danger was real, and Severo knew exactly which direction it was coming from. The next morning I walked into Severo's office without knocking, without asking, without sparing a thought for Raffaello's rule number 3. You posted 2 men outside my building. My mother has anxiety issues. If she looks out the window and sees a car with 2 strangers parked there all night, she's going to spiral. He was standing behind his desk, tie loosened, the top button of his shirt undone. Early morning, before the meetings began, when the office was still half empty and the armor wasn't fully fastened. He looked at me without responding for 2 full seconds, and when he spoke, his voice was low and controlled. Certain people read proximity as significance. And am I? It came out before any internal filter could catch it. Direct. Weighted with something I refused to name. Significant? Severo looked away. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked away. His jaw locked. The fingers of his right hand closed around the edge of the desk, and his eyes went to the window behind me, to Manhattan, to the skyline, to anything other than my face asking a question he didn't want to answer. The men stay. I walked out of the office furious, but he hadn't said no. That night, sitting on my bed with the laptop balanced on my knees, I typed Marchetti Family New York into the search bar and hit enter. The results loaded in under a second, and each one was worse than the last. Articles about federal investigations closed for lack of evidence. Threads on organized crime forums about who controlled the freight routes through Red Hook. A photograph of Vittorio Marchetti in the 90s, younger and leaner, surrounded by men in suits inside a restaurant I recognized by the doorframe alone, Leander's, and a tabloid headline that had never been formally substantiated. Marchetti Import and Trade, legitimate company, or Cosa Nostra front. I shut the laptop and stared up at the ceiling, where the paint was peeling in the left corner, and the streetlight outside came through the gap in the curtain in a long, pale bar. Elise had been right. The restaurant, the security detail, the men rising to their feet, the deference at Cipriani, the call in Italian punctuated by blood and handle it. All of it fit into a picture I could no longer pretend not to see. The man who canceled my lunch and then sent a plate from his family's restaurant without a note. The man who caught my arm at the curb with a firmness that wasn't brutality. The man who looked away when I asked whether I was significant. That same man made grown men go still in a closed room and walked out with blood on his cuff. I knew who Severo Marchetti was. The question now was something else entirely. 2 days later, Walking back from the subway, I covered the 4 blocks between the station and my building with my bag clutched against my body and my eyes on the pavement. The street was quiet. It was late. The shops had already shuttered, and the streetlights threw long shadows across the empty sidewalk. I turned the corner onto my block and felt, before I heard, that someone was behind me. Footsteps matched to mine. Not faster, not slower, the same cadence at the same distance. I picked up my pace. The footsteps did the same. My heart kicked. Adrenaline crashed through me, and I was a beat away from breaking into a run when Tommaso stepped out of a side door I hadn't even known was there, planted himself between me and whoever was behind me, and stood still, a human concrete wall that didn't need to say a word to make the footsteps behind me stop. "What happened?" I asked, once I could breathe. "Nothing," but his face said it had been everything. Chapter 5. The Crack No One Sees. The gate slid open without a sound, and the car climbed an oak-lined drive that ended in front of a mansion built more to intimidate than to welcome. Tot Hill, Staten Island. The Marchetti residence sat at the crown of a wooded slope, far enough from Manhattan to feel like a separate country, and close enough that their grip on the city was never out of view. Dark stone facade, tall windows, double wooden doors that a butler had already opened by the time I'd finished smoothing my dress for the 10th time. I had refused the dress Severo had sent to the office. That night I wore something of my own, a dark green dress I'd bought on sale, the one Elise had once said made my eyes look dramatically intense. It wasn't Cipriani, it wasn't custom-tailored, it was mine, and it was the most I could offer without giving up the part of myself that still belonged to Queens. Severo was waiting for me in the foyer, and when he saw me, his eyes traveled the length of the dress in a quick sweep he barely managed to disguise. He didn't say a word, but he looked. Lucrezia Marchetti received me at the doorway of the dining room with a smile that was equal parts warmth and assessment, eyes moving from my shoes to my posture, while her hands closed over mine with a soft pressure that could have been affection or warning. Her birthday. The Marchetti matriarch was marking another year, and the dining table held the survivors of a dynasty I was only beginning to map. Vittorio Marchetti occupied the head of the table, wheelchair, spine straight, hands folded on the linen with the quiet authority of a man who had once run an empire and was now watching his son do the same. His eyes were the most unsettling thing about him. Clear, patient, reading every person in the room like he had unlimited time and decades of accumulated information to consult. When Severo introduced me, Vittorio tilted his head and said in Italian, with the casual ease of someone commenting on the weather, "Damiani. That name is familiar to me. I understood every word. My family's Italian was functional, inherited from a father who'd sung in Neapolitan while he cooked, and Vittorio's sentence landed before I could mask the response. I went still, half a second, maybe less, but enough for Severo to register it. He redirected the conversation with a remark about the wine, and the table moved on, but I had logged his reaction. Fast, precise, protective. He hadn't wanted Vittorio to continue, and I wanted to know why. Before the question could take root, someone caught me by the arm and pulled me into a corner near the fireplace, with the energy of a 21-year-old hurricane. "Are you the secretary who said something about my brother's bulge?" Niamh Marchetti had dark eyes the same shade as Severo's, hair loose down to her waist, and a smile that took up her entire face. She was looking at me with the unfiltered admiration of someone who had just met a celebrity. "Tommaso told me, you're my hero. I wanted to die. I wanted the floor of the Marchetti mansion to crack open and drop me to the center of the earth because of every reckless thing my mouth had ever produced. That single line in the office was the one I most wanted to scrub from existence, and apparently it had been promoted to family folklore. That's not exactly what I said," I tried. "Tommaso says you did, and Tommaso doesn't lie. He doesn't even speak enough to lie." Niamh adopted me on the spot. She stayed glued to my side throughout dinner, mapping the table out for me. Names, roles, alliances, with the casual ease of someone narrating a board game rather than describing what I now knew was a criminal organization. When Niccolo Marchetti, the middle brother, 2 years younger than Severo, according to the rapid intel Niamh whispered against my ear, sat down across from me, the smile arrived before he did. Niccolo was the visual antithesis of his older brother, charismatic with no apparent effort, eyes that laughed before his mouth did, expansive gestures, and an energy that filled the space around him with the lightness of a man who had never been required to carry the weight Severo carried. He reached across the table, took my hand with casual firmness, and looked at me with the amused curiosity of a person who'd just found an exotic animal in the backyard. "Where on earth did you find this one?" he said, glancing at Severo. Severo didn't answer. Niccolò laughed. Open, loud, the kind of laugh that drew a disapproving glance from Lucrezia and lifted one of Vittorio's eyebrows at the head of the table. After dinner, I slipped out the back door into the garden. The night air was cold, biting, and I needed a few minutes away from the gazes that measured, the snippets of Italian I caught over my shoulder, and the constant gravitational presence of Severo, who, even when he wasn't looking at me, seemed to occupy every corner of my awareness. He came out a few minutes later. He stopped 2 steps away, took off his suit jacket, and held it out without a word. The fabric was still warm, and I took it, hating myself for taking it, because the jacket carried his scent, and wearing that scent meant admitting something I wasn't yet ready to name. "Who is Leander?" I asked, looking at the garden because looking at him at that distance was too dangerous. "My brother." The answer was fast, short, weighted. "What happened?" "He died." His hands tightened at his sides, an involuntary movement I noticed for the first time. I didn't push. I let the silence settle for a few seconds, let the word find its place between us, and then I said the thing I was thinking without filtering it. "You put his name on the restaurant so he wouldn't just be a memory, so he'd still exist somewhere." Severo turned his head. He looked at me in a way I hadn't seen before, not with control, not with calculation, not with the armor he wore in every other situation. He looked at me with the open, unprotected face of a man who had just heard something no one had ever said to him, and that he had clearly needed to hear for a very long time. His jaw locked, his eyes shimmered with something he caught and contained before it could break the surface, and he didn't answer. He didn't need to. I told him about my father, about the accident when I was 8, about a mother who never spoke of it afterward, about growing up paying bills and swallowing questions. It was the first time we spoke to each other without layers. No provocation, no hierarchy, no office between us. 2 people in a garden, in the cold, exchanging the parts that hurt. He touched my face, his hand lifted slowly, fingers tracing the line of my jaw, thumb coming to rest against my cheek, with a softness that contradicted everything I knew about the strength in that hand. I didn't pull back. His lips were inches from mine, and I could feel the warmth of his breath on my skin, and the world had collapsed down to the small space we were standing in. The phone rang. The sound shattered the silence with the brutality of an alarm, and I watched the armor reassemble itself in real time, eyes hardening, jaw setting, his hand sliding away from my face to retrieve the device from his pocket. He answered, listened for 5 seconds, and hung up. "Tommaso is taking you home." He walked off without looking back, and the night turned colder the instant he was gone. In the car, Tommaso drove in silence for 10 minutes before saying, without taking his eyes off the road, "He doesn't talk about his brother." The sentence hung in the air for the rest of the ride, and I understood the weight of what had just happened in that garden, not because of the kiss that almost was, but because of what had come before it. Severo Marchetti had given me something he didn't give anyone, and I knew that was more dangerous than any touch could have been. A few days later, he extended an invitation that wasn't really an invitation. There were contracts to go over, documents to translate, and a house in Montauk where the work would be more efficient, away from the interruptions of the office. I accepted knowing it wasn't about contracts, and he knew I knew, and neither of us pretended otherwise. We left Saturday morning. The driver took the Long Island Expressway, and I pretended to work on my laptop for the entire 3-hour drive, because Severo wouldn't take his eyes off the window, and I wouldn't take my eyes off the screen, and anything else would have collapsed the fragile balance we were both performing. When the asphalt gave way to a sandy track winding toward the coast, and the sea finally appeared on the right, he spoke for the first time. A short remark about the house having belonged to the family for 40 years, and I understood that was the closest thing to welcome he knew how to offer. The house was unlike anything I had connected with him. Simple, walls of pale wood, windows that faced the ocean, and a kitchen that smelled of olive oil and rosemary. Severo cooked. The revelation took the floor out from under me. He moved through the kitchen with the same precision he applied to everything else, but with something added. Fluidity, rhythm, the muscle memory of someone who had learned this before he had learned how to intimidate. "Did you think I ate documents?" "I assumed you had a private chef and 3 nutritionists," I said, trying to chop onions without crying and failing. "My grandmother cooked. In Sicily. I used to sit on a stool and watch. The image, Severo as a boy on a kitchen stool, watching his grandmother cook, was so removed from the man standing in front of me that it ached. I tried to help, and burned the garlic inside 2 minutes, and he looked at the pan with the expression of a man who had just witnessed a crime. You can translate documents in 3 languages, but you can't tell when garlic's done. Garlic doesn't pay rent. Something in his eyes shifted. The weight lifted. The lines around his mouth eased. And for a beat, I caught a glimpse of the boy on the kitchen stool looking at me from inside the man he had become. That night we worked in the living room facing the ocean. He in one corner, I in another, each with our documents and our silence. But it was a different kind of silence. The first comfortable one. The first that didn't need to be filled with words, because the other's presence was already enough. I caught him watching. He didn't look away. I didn't look away. His eyes held mine for a stretch of time I couldn't measure. 15 seconds, maybe more, and the tension filled the room until the air felt thick. If you're going to keep looking at me like that, at least blink. No. No what? I'm not going to blink. Neither of us moved. The sea was breaking against the rocks outside. The lamplight warmed the lines of his face, and the distance between us was the heaviest object in the room. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to cross those 10 feet of floorboards and find out what happened when the distance ended. But I stayed where I was, and he stayed where he was. And what didn't happen that night carried more weight than any touch would have. The next morning I woke up early and walked out onto the deck. The sea was gray, the wind cold, and Severo was already there with his back to me, phone pressed to his ear, voice in that register I knew now, deep, flat, every word carrying a sentence. If he comes near the port again, don't bother calling me, handle it. He ended the call. I stood in the doorway, bare feet on the cold planks, with the certain knowledge that handle it, in the Marchetti vocabulary, did not mean negotiate. It was a terminal verb, no appeal. And the man using it was the same one who cooked with his grandmother's olive oil and couldn't stop looking at me. The question formed right there, on that morning, with the sea ahead of me and the freezing wood under my feet. Could the woman I was survive next to the man he was? On the drive back to Manhattan, I sent Neve a message with the photograph I'd found in the dead files. The 2 boys, L&S, Summer. The reply came in seconds. That's Leander and Severo. He was 7 in that picture. Where did you find this? I stared at the image on my phone screen. The 7-year-old boy holding his older brother's hand. The boy who grew up, lost his brother, and built a restaurant so his name wouldn't disappear from the world. Something moved inside me that wasn't attraction. It was something larger and more terrifying, and I didn't have a name for it. Not yet. Chapter 6. I Choose to Stay. The email landed on an unremarkable morning between 2 import contracts and a coffee I was about to deliver to Severo's office. Morrison & Reed, a law firm specializing in corporate work, was offering me an internship in their legal department. Solid salary, hours that worked around school, health insurance comprehensive enough to cover my mother's treatment. Everything I needed, everything I should have wanted. Elise had submitted my resume without telling me. Someone has to think about your future while you're busy moonlighting for the Mafia, said the message attached to the forward. I read the offer 3 times, and each time the way out felt more concrete and harder to take. That afternoon, walking down the hall toward the pantry, I stopped when I heard voices coming from Severo's office. The door was cracked open, and Raffaello's voice was unmistakable, calm, measured, unhurried. She needs to go before she becomes a problem. She stays. Severo. Raffaello let a pause hang there, a silence that carried more weight than the words. She is the most dangerous thing that has ever walked into this office, and it has nothing to do with guns. I retreated before either of them caught me, slid back into my chair, and stared at the Morrison & Reed email with my pulse running on a rhythm that had nothing to do with a job offer. The next morning, a courier dropped an envelope on my desk. No return address, no postmark, no branding, plain brown paper. I opened it with cold fingers and slid out a photograph. Black and white, faintly yellowed by time, it showed a middle-aged man standing in front of a facade I recognized at once. Leander's. The man was in profile, smiling at someone outside the frame, wearing a leather jacket I had seen 1,000 times in the photos that lined our apartment in Queens. It was my father, Aldo Damiani, dead since I was 8 years old, standing in front of my boss's family restaurant. On the back, in a hand I didn't know, ask your boss why he knew your father. I stood up, crossed the antechamber, opened the door to Severo's office without knocking, and set the photo down on his desk with a hand that was shaking, not from fear, but from rage. That's my father, in front of your restaurant. I want an explanation. Now. Severo looked at the photo, then at me. His expression didn't change. but something in his eyes shut. A door he locked before I had any chance of seeing what was behind it. Your father was a regular at the restaurant. A lot of people are. A lot of people don't have daughters working for the owner. He held my gaze for 5 seconds. He offered nothing else. The half-truth hung between us with the weight of everything he wasn't saying, and I knew, with the same certainty I brought to a poorly drafted contract, that there was more, but he wasn't going to give it to me here, and I had no leverage to force him. I tucked the photograph into the inside pocket of my blazer, alongside the other one, L&S, Summer, and walked out. 2 days later, Gideon Salvarezza escalated. Photographs of me and Severo at Cipriani surfaced on 3 online tabloids. Headline: The New Don Marchetti and His Mystery Companion. Who is the woman on the Cosa Nostra heir's arm? My mother called in a panic. A neighbor had seen the article and shown it to her. Gemma's voice on the phone trembled in the way I knew too well. The prelude to days locked in her room, curtains drawn, sleeping pills. I hung up with a knot tightening in my stomach and walked into Severo's office, slamming the door behind me. My mother is panicking. My face is on the internet next to yours. I have a life outside this bubble, Severo. I have a mother who doesn't sleep when she's afraid. I have a school where, by tomorrow, people are going to look at me differently. The anger was real, raw, and for the first time I made no effort to soften it. He was standing behind the desk, and his expression shifted as I spoke. The armor cracked, didn't fall, but cracked just enough for me to see something I hadn't expected. Guilt. Not the calculated kind, not a strategic apology, real guilt, in the eyes of a man who was used to controlling every variable and who had failed at the only one that mattered. I know, he said. The voice was low, stripped of its usual chill. Then tell me one true thing. One. He looked at me, and what happened in his eyes was the most uncontrolled thing I'd ever seen in Severo Marchetti. His composure faltered, his jaw tightened, and the words came out with the visible effort of a man unlocking a door he had kept sealed his entire life. I don't know how to stop looking at you, and I don't know what to do with that, and I have always known what to do with everything. The office went silent. The Manhattan skyline was glittering behind him, and I was standing 3 steps away with anger still hot in my chest, and something hotter rising underneath it. I closed the distance. Not him. Me. I put my hand on his chest, felt his heart hitting against my palm, and kissed him. Slow, deliberate, carrying the weight of 7 weeks of tension and provocation and sleepless nights. He answered with a contained urgency that told me everything his words hadn't. His hand at my waist pulling me in, the other rising to cup the back of my neck, his mouth opening against mine with a hunger he had been holding back for too long. When we broke apart, I was out of breath and absolutely clear. This doesn't mean I trust you. I know. And it doesn't mean I'm going to stop asking questions. I'd expect nothing less. That night I called Elise from my couch. I'm not taking the Morrison and Reed offer. The silence on the other end stretched 3 seconds. You are insane. Probably. Does he at least kiss well? I'm not answering that. You just did. In the days that followed, Severo moved. The tabloid pulled the story. I didn't ask how. Security around my mother's building was quietly reinforced, and Gemma never noticed. And a message was sent to Gideon Salvarezza through channels I didn't want to know about. If her name appears anywhere again, the next thing I send won't be a photograph. At the end of that week, I found Severo in the office after hours. The floor was empty, the lights low, and he was sitting behind his desk with his hands resting flat on the surface. But his hands were different. The knuckles were red, swollen, and there was a fresh cut on the index finger of his right hand he hadn't bothered to clean. Tommaso, posted at the door, answered the question before I could ask it. The Don dealt with a problem. I looked at the hands. The same hands that had touched my face in the mansion garden. The same hands that had caught my arm at the curb. The same hands that had risen up the curve of my waist that afternoon, in the kiss I had started. Those hands had just hurt someone, and the blood on his knuckles was the proof that the man who had kissed me with restraint was the same man who handled problems with his fists. I stayed, aware of the weight, eyes wide open. That night, Severo came to Queens for the first time. My mother was in Long Island with Aunt Rosaria, her first trip in 3 years. The apartment was mine alone. Small, a living room with a sagging sofa, a kitchen that fit one person at a time, a bookshelf packed with law textbooks and walls hung with photos of my mother. He looked out of place there, too large for the space, too formal for the couch, and at the same time more real than I had ever seen him. Without the mahogany office, without the stone mansion, without the men who stood up. Here it was just him, in my world, breathing my air. He stopped in front of the bookshelf, ran his fingers along the spines, and pulled out the civil code with one hand. He flipped to a random page and started reading aloud in Italian, the dry vocabulary of legislation coming out of his mouth with the cadence of poetry, every article sounding like a verse, every paragraph carrying a weight the law had never managed to acquire in my classroom. I laughed. Not a polite smile, not a held-back laugh. I laughed for real, no reservation, for the first time in front of him. Severo stopped reading. He looked at me and said, in a voice I had never heard from him, "Do that again." What? Laugh. The book was still open in his hand, and I understood in that moment, with a certainty that frightened me, that I was in love with him. Not with the power, not with the danger, not with the face that silenced entire rooms. In love with the man who read the civil code in Italian as though it were poetry, who cooked with his grandmother's olive oil, and who was asking me to laugh again because the sound of my laughter was the only thing he didn't know how to control. He kissed me again in the living room, and this time, there was no hurry and no restraint. There was decision. His hand rose up the back of my neck, closed in my hair at the root, and tilted my head to the angle he wanted. I protested against his mouth only out of reflex. He laughed softly into the kiss. "You talk too much," he murmured against my ear, and his scent was already on my neck, and I hated how familiar it had become. "And you're holding the wrong part of my hair." "I'm not holding the wrong part." He proved it, with a small movement that pulled a sound out of me I had never made in my life. My hand closed on the front of his shirt. I knew exactly where I was. The living room I had furnished with my mother's second-hand pieces, and at the same time I didn't, because the entire geography of the apartment had rearranged itself the moment Severo Marchetti put both hands on me. He led me to the bedroom without picking me up, with his hand at the base of my spine setting the pace, the exact same gesture from Cipriani, except now without the dress, without the audience, without the electric fence of "this belongs to me." Now it was just mine, and the difference moved through my body like a current. The first time he took off my shirt, he stopped. He looked. Not the way I had imagined a man like him would look, with hurry, with hunger, but with that surgical attention he brought to contracts, as though he were committing clauses to memory. His thumb found my collarbone, then my sternum, then the place between my ribs where my heart was making a scene. "May I?" I closed my eyes. Severo Marchetti was asking for permission. Asking, in a low voice, with the inflection of a man who knew that the word no would leave my mouth before it reached his ears if I wanted it to. I had never understood what power was until that moment, because power, I now knew, wasn't imposing. It was being able to impose and choosing to ask. "You may." His shirt came off before my pants did, and the tattoo I had been catching glimpses of for weeks through a rolled sleeve extended down his shoulder, across his ribs, ending in a saint I didn't recognize above his left hip. I ran my hand across the ink, and he trembled. Severo Marchetti, who didn't tremble for anything, trembled under my fingers. I filed that away, mentally, to use against him later. His mouth moved down, along my neck, my shoulder, my breast, which he held with a firmness that wasn't gentle and wasn't rough. It was exact, like everything else about him. I said his name at some point, and he stopped. He lifted his eyes. Again. "No. Severo. No." He laughed, actually laughed, low against my skin, and the retaliation came slowly. His mouth kept its descent, and I said his name again, this time without him commanding it, because his tongue had found the precise place, and the rest of my body had stopped having any relationship to my will. I gripped the sheet. I gripped his hair. Severo Marchetti, with his head between my legs in my mother's apartment. I could have laughed if I'd had any breath left. When he came back up and fitted himself against me, he stopped one more time. His forehead found mine. His eyes were so dark the iris had disappeared, and his breath came out unsteady, the first unsteady thing he had let me see all night. "Look at me." I looked. He moved into me slowly. Slow in the way only someone moves who is controlling his own body so he doesn't control yours. And I understood in that second that everything Severo had given me up to that point, the jacket in the garden, the gnocchi without a note, the hand at my waist, the stay, had been the public version of something he was showing me now for the first time without armor. I didn't close my eyes. He didn't close his. And that was how, looking at each other, he moved for the first time, and I moved against him, and the rest of the night refused to follow any logic I could later put into words. When it ended, it wasn't a wave or any of the things I'd been told to expect. It was the sensation of a knot coming undone that I hadn't known was tied. I stayed trembling under him for a stretch of time I couldn't measure, and he stayed on top of me without collapsing, without dismantling, without becoming dead weight. Just present. His breath on my neck and his hand closed over mine as though I might slip away if he let go. I didn't surrender. I chose. The distinction, slight on paper, was everything. Later, lying against his chest with my breathing still finding its way back to normal, I felt his hand move up through my hair, with a softness that was the most unexpected and truest thing he had ever given me. The silence was the most comfortable silence I'd ever known, and something had shifted between us that wouldn't be undoing itself. I woke up alone the next morning. The bed still held his heat in the sheets, and the pillow next to mine carried the woody scent I no longer needed to identify. It was his, and that was enough. The apartment was quiet, but it wasn't empty. In the kitchen on the table there was coffee already made. Double espresso, no sugar, in my mother's blue mug, the only one without a chip. The old machine made thin, watery coffee, but he had wrestled something out of it. The image of Severo Marchetti standing in my queen's kitchen at 6 a.m, fighting with a coffee maker that stuck on the second button, was absurd and perfect at the same time. Next to the mug, the photograph. L&S, summer. The two boys in front of the big house, the younger holding the older one's hand. He had taken it out of my blazer at some point during the night, and the gesture hit me with a force out of all proportion to the size of the paper. He knew I had kept it. He had known from the beginning, and instead of asking for it back, he had left it there, next to the coffee, as if to say, "What's mine is also yours." On the back, in a firm, slanted hand, I knew from every document I had reviewed in 2 months, a single word: stay. I ran my thumb across the ink, looked at the mug, at the chair he must have sat in, at the door he had walked through before I woke up, because Severo Marchetti didn't know how to remain for the after, didn't know how to occupy the soft, vulnerable space of a morning, but he had tried in the only language he had, in silence, with coffee, and with the most precious thing he owned, and I decided, in my voice, on my terms, with my eyes open, to stay. I only found out later that it was the worst decision of my life. Lena here. That wraps up book 1, and I've already finished book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. 43 Days of Passion. That was all Severo gave me before turning love into evidence of a crime, before everything fell apart. I believed in the coffee waiting for me, in his hands on my waist, in the way he said stay, as if he were afraid of losing me. For the first time, I thought I wasn't a piece in anyone's game. Then Ottavio returned from Sicily. He walked into the dining room of the mansion in Todd Hill, with that slow, almost lazy smile, stopped beside Severo, and said loud enough for the whole family to hear, "Damiani." What an interesting coincidence. The same last name as the man we made disappear 16 years ago. The air froze. Niamh stopped laughing. Lucrezia set down her glass. Vittorio tilted his head, curious. And Severo. Severo didn't turn pale. He didn't deny it. He didn't look at me. He only sustained Ottavio's gaze with that murderous calm I now knew so well, and replied in a low voice, "Careful with your next word." The silence that followed was deafening. It was there, standing among the entire Marchetti family, that I finally understood the cruelest truth of all. I was never the secretary he chose. I was never the woman he fell in love with. I was the living proof of an old crime, and Severo Marchetti didn't keep me close out of desire. He kept me close because I was the only thing that could still destroy him. Like I said, that was just a taste of book 2. To watch it uncensored, just click on the first link here in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in a few seconds. Remember, just click on the first link down here in the comments, and book 2 complete, no ads, no interruptions, will already be available for you. It's very simple. Book 2 is something I'm loving making. You're loving it too, so I promise there will be more. It's where you find increasingly spicy stories, a true dark romance. And precisely because this version is getting more and more heated, the video isn't well accepted publicly on YouTube. This closed environment is where I can actually share my essence and where I feel free to do my best work for you. More news coming soon. I'll be waiting for you on the other side.